You enjoyed breakfast. Oh, now it's on. Okay. I hope you enjoyed breakfast and are ready for a really stimulating discussion about anti-Semitism on campus and what the relationship is between free speech and civil rights on this particular issue. I think everybody has seen in the news that after October 7th, there was a lot of, let's say, activity on campuses surrounding the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And there were lots of reported incidents of anti-Semitism and of harassment of Jewish students. This actually well predates October 7th in terms of there being issues of anti-Semitism on America's campuses that may not have been visible to most of us. But for those who are in the Jewish civil rights movement, this is an issue they've been working on for decades. So we have with us three experts who've been thinking about these issues for quite some time. Our paper that we're going to be discussing is, this is really fun, it's being written by two David Bernsteins. They do have different middle initials, so we will be able to keep them straight. David E. and David L. are our paper authors, and then we have two excellent discussants here. I'm going to provide a quick bio so that you know who these people are. And then our plan is we're going to have a conversation. David and I will have a conversation for about 10 minutes about what the paper is going to cover. And then we're going to turn to our discussants for them to provide comments and their thoughts on the issues that are at play. And then it's your turn, and we will have an opportunity for Q&A. All right, so that's the plan. Who are these people? To my left, David Bernstein, David E. David E. Bernstein is a professor here at the Scalia Law School, and he's been teaching here since 1995. He often challenges the conventional wisdom with prodigious research and sharp original analysis, and you can tell this by some of the titles of some of his books. One of his favorite book, my favorite book of his, is called You Can't Say That, which is quite apropos for today's conversation. And then his most recent book is called Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. And he is also the executive director of the Liberty and Law Center, hosting this conversation today. So thank you, David, for being here. To his left, Ken Marcus is the founder and chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law. He's also a lecturer at law at George Washington University and the author of The Definition of Anti-Semitism, Oxford University Press. So you can see right off the top why we may have Mr. Marcus here with us. During his public service career, Marcus has served as Assistant U.S. Secretary for Education for Civil Rights, Staff Director at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and General Deputy Assistant U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Also has a George Mason University connection. He is a member of the Board of Governors for George Mason University and formerly served as a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the university's law school. So thank you for coming and joining us today, Ken. And finally, we have Samuel Goldman, Executive Director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom and Democracy and Director of the Politics and Values Program. His first book, God's Country, Christian Zionism in America, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. His second book, After Nationalism, was published in early 2021. And in addition to doing academic research, he also comments in the public press. So this is our panelists, and we're going to get started. All right. So, David, what is the problem? So I said that this has been going on for decades. What is the problem that we are trying to solve on campus, and what manifestations has that problem taken?
So the underlying issue, both David L. Bernstein and myself, we both believe in freedom of speech. We are liberals in the broad sense of the word. We think that liberalism is good for society, and we also think that liberalism is good for the Jews, that societies that adopt liberal values are societies where Jews thrive, and Jews thrive in societies and help societies thrive when the societies have liberal values. So the dilemma arises, well, what do you do when you have eruptions of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism has been an increasing problem on university campuses for a while, but it has really exploded since October 7th. Now, some of the anti-Semitic actions really aren't a dilemma as such, because they involve illiberal actions, actions that liberals don't think need to be allowed, like vandalism, harassment of individuals, threats of violence, encampments that violate school rules and take over part of campus without any sort of permission, students at somewhere like UCLA where they would ask you if you're a Zionist before they would let you go to the library, that sort of thing. Those are things, if you believe in freedom of speech, you also believe in reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. You don't believe that you could threaten people or harass individuals. So those, we just think, okay, apply the university rules or civil rights laws. The dilemma comes when you have issues of freedom that are pure speech, hateful speech, speech that's extremely offensive, speech that makes Jewish students feel very uncomfortable, and that is arguably potentially even illegal if it becomes a severe and pervasive situation where students' education are affected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Now, David and I both agree that even grossly offensive speech that makes people uncomfortable should be protected on campus. So if you were to ask David L. or myself the questions that were asked at the congressional hearing, should students be permitted to call for the genocide of the Jewish people, I think we both agree, as horrific as that is, the proper response to that is not to have rules cracking down on hate speech, because that would, the underlying ideology of cracking down on hate speech is ultimately illiberal. If the colleges turn fully illiberal, again, liberalism is good for Jews, Jews are good for liberalism, and so forth, so we don't want that. The dilemma is this. What do you do? We also believe that Jewish students should be treated fairly and equally with other students. And what do you do about a university that cracks down on every microaggression, every marginally hateful comment that someone makes, denounces student groups or professors when they say things that are offensive to other student groups, but are completely silent and quiescent when Jewish students are attacked verbally? And the problem there is that you have a problem of equal protection of this Jewish students and a violation of the civil rights laws. You can't, I'll give an example. Northwestern University has had a whole series of pretty intense hate speech since 10/7 against Jewish students, including students on the day when admitted students were visiting campus calling for the closing down of the Hillel Foundation, which is the Jewish student organization on campus. You can't imagine that Northwestern would be tolerant of unadmitted students, day students calling down for closing the gay students organization or the black students organization, the women's students organization, but they, it took them very many days to say anything about it, and it was pretty quiet. And then a few years earlier, there had been a series of notes found around the campus on Northwestern that said, and this is all they said, it's okay to be white. Now, for a variety of reasons, in the context of campuses, you can imagine that those notes were still kind of a little bit provocative, but they were hardly the most egregious example of hate speech ever. But Northwestern issued no fewer than 4 press releases from the university office denouncing those notes. So the question is, what do you do when universities are unequally treating different students when hate speech is involved?
So what is the debate within the Jewish civil rights movement? So do you and David, do the two Davids agree on everything on this issue, or are there points of difference between the two of you?
So this is where the two Davids have a difference of opinion, and it's more of a strategic difference than a philosophical difference. David L. believes that the correct response to that sort of situation is to just try to level up, to just insist that universities adopt rules that hate speech is allowed, so long as it doesn't reach the point where it's harassment or otherwise illegal, and we would give a pretty broad scope before we'd say that it should be illegal. It should really be harassment. So he says we don't want to succumb to the underlying ideology the underlying illiberal ideology that universities should be cracking down on any sort of speech. Universities should be neutral institutions. So the proper, and he's afraid that if the Jewish community just lobbies to have the same kind of university reaction to hate speech against Jews as they sometimes have to other groups, that they'll just put Jews into the category of protected classes, and the DEI kind of ideology and the woke ideology that's behind a lot of the illiberalism on campus will actually be strengthened. I, at least tentatively, and we haven't finished the paper yet, so we'll see how it comes out, but tentatively, I think strategically, the right goal, the right way to do this is to make universities apply their rules evenly, partly for the philosophical reason that it's just unequal treatment of Jewish students to have hate speech against them treated differently from hate speech against others, but also for the strategic reason that I think the reason that universities do crack down on hate speech is not simply they don't like speech or we don't want freedom of speech. It's an ideological reason. They prefer favorite groups for ideological reasons. They're trying to promote certain ideological goals, and if you make them apply the rules evenly, and not just to Jewish students, but to any students who are not typically the subject of their concern, white students, other Asian students, whoever it may be, then if they have to apply the rules equally, then their ideological goal is no longer being served of treating people unequally, and then they'd be much more likely to consider neutral free speech rules that we would approve of. And indeed, I would argue with David that we've seen an example of this in a related context, which is that universities were going around until recently making all sorts of statements on various public issues, almost always from a left-leaning perspective. And suddenly when people say, well, how come you're not denouncing Hamas murdering, raping, torturing, etc., Jewish civilians? They say, oh, you know what, maybe we should have institutional neutrality. Maybe we should reconsider the Calvin principles. And I don't think they would have done that if we just said, oh, just adopt the Calvin principles. That's a good idea. Let's level up. They would say, oh, why should we? But once you say, okay, you can't only serve certain ideological masters, you have to be neutral in how you denounce things, all of a sudden they want institutional neutrality, which is actually a good result.
All right, so as you are writing this paper, you have been interviewing a number of people to hear perspectives on this question and to weigh in on the debate that the two Davids are having. What are you learning from the interviews that you've been doing, and what is the sort of the range of ideological and non-ideological viewpoints here?
Right, so I think that we have both extremes represented, and these are all people who are, broadly speaking, liberals, either sort of classic ACLU, sort of civil libertarians, or people on sort of the libertarian side of the spectrum. So it's all people who both believe in free speech and who also are concerned that the rights of Jewish students are not trampled upon. And we have opinions ranging from you should never ask a university to crack down on speech, even for strategic reasons, because that's illiberal, it's oppressive, it will just encourage the bureaucracy to expand its DEI bureaucracy even further. In some cases, maybe they'll just pretend that they're protecting Jewish students while there's a lot of attention going on, but then they'll just further entrench their hate speech rules. So we should only ask them to adopt neutral rules. We should never ask them to apply hate speech rules neutrally. And then there's the complete opposite end of the spectrum from people who otherwise generally agree on the vast majority of these things, who say absolutely not. The only way to resolve this problem is to force universities to play by their own rules. And only when they have to really accept the full consequences of applying the rules evenly to all groups and not just to favor groups will they be willing to adopt proper free speech rules.
So there is quite a range of perspectives on how to resolve this dilemma, and a lot of research that the two Davids have done. We've asked Ken and Samuel in particular to help the two Davids narrow down what to focus on, because there is a wealth of information here. So what should they focus on, and then how should they think about the 2 points of view of the two authors here? How might we be able to help resolve that? So let me turn over to Ken.
Thank you, Debbie. It's an honor to be here and to comment on the two Davids, one of whom I'm told we're supposed to address as the more handsome David, and the other and the other is the smarter one. I'll let you all sort that out. As a member of the Board of Visitors of this university, I'm very proud of the work being done here at Scalia Law School. Scalia has been recognized recently as one of the top 30 law schools in the United States. I believe that that's an understatement. I believe that we are now among the very top law schools in the country, so I'm very pleased to be here. This is an important moment to be discussing this issue. Over the last year and a half, we have certainly seen far more and worse anti-Semitic incidents in higher education than ever before. During this academic year, we're not seeing quite the volume as a year ago, but this is clearly the second highest rate of anti-Semitic incidents that we've seen in our lifetime. Moreover, the incidents that we've seen in recent weeks have had an intensity that we hadn't seen before. We're hearing not just from the river to the sea, but glory to the martyrs in reference to the Hamas atrocities becoming the more prominent chant. It's also timely for another reason. I would say that, interestingly, among those Jewish communal leaders who have been most forceful in demanding strong responses to anti-Semitism, often they are among those who are most forceful in insisting on free speech. You have often those calling for aggressive actions on anti-Semitism being civil libertarians. At the same time, we've just had a presidential election. And we have a president-elect who has spoken frequently and boldly about the need to address the incidents on campus. It is interesting, and I would argue not self-contradictory, that the president who signed the Trump executive order on combating anti-Semitism is the same president who signed the executive order on free speech. So we have, not just within the Jewish community, but more broadly in the United States, the phenomenon that some of those people who are most bullish on wanting to respond aggressively to anti-Semitism being those who are also most committed to free speech. And the question is, how can we deal with it? I would argue that the challenge is not to figure out when free speech should bow to equal protection and when equal protection should bow to free speech, but rather how can we accomplish both of them at the same time and maximally. I think it's commendable that the Davids have emphasized not just speech, but also conduct. The fact is that many of the discussions of free speech that one sees in the blogosphere downplay the fact that there is so much physical assault, so much vandalism, so much direct threat of violence. The real incidents that we're seeing on campus are often the kinds of cases that the Davids might refer to as not hard cases, but university administrations aren't finding them easy either. To paraphrase Jonathan Adler, universities are under-regulating conduct, even while they're over-regulating speech. And we should avoid a situation in which we suggest that the campus anti-Semitism situation is largely one about speech. When we talk about the speech issues with campus anti-Semitism, I think it's important to recognize that some of the biggest infringements on speech are reductions of Jewish speech. In other words, the issue isn't just how should the Jewish community respond to assaults or hostile environments, but also what do we do about the fact that it's so hard, if not impossible, to have Jewish pro-Israel speakers on campus. That the speakers are often not allowed, or if they are allowed, they're not allowed to be on the campus itself. Or that Zionists are so often unable to speak, they're punished for their speaking, they're excluded from student organizations, they're told if you're a Zionist you cannot speak here. There are massive infringements on the speech of the Jewish students, and I think that's important in part because it goes to what should be the response from the Jewish community to these incidents. When we're trying to figure out how to deal with this, I think that there are a couple points that I think are worth thinking about. If the question is what should the Jewish community do, then I think it's worth considering questions about the history and politics of the Jewish community and what the community has done or not done before. And I would suggest that there's a literature on this, that Mark Dollinger's work on, for instance, the quest for inclusion, that the work of Stuart Svonkin address the various competing demands on the Jewish community, why during some periods they have been more active, more quietist, why they've pushed for free speech, why they have or haven't pushed for various sorts of action. The other point I would make is that the federal government has tried to negotiate these tensions, these potentially conflicting positions in a particular way. And I think it's worth considering whether you think it's appropriate or not. The general position of the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights has been that when offensive speech that is protected under the First Amendment rises to the level that it is sufficiently severe or pervasive that it creates a hostile environment, we do not say, this is free speech and so we do nothing, nor do we say, this is a hostile environment and so we should punish the speaker. Rather, we should do two things. On the one hand, we should protect the speaker from anything that is chilling. But on the other hand, consistent with that limitation, we should require that the institution respond promptly and effectively. Now, I think there are two ways of looking at that. One is you could say this is a way of resolving the tension or resolving the problem. The other is you could say maybe it's not practical. Maybe it's not possible to be effective if you are not being punitive. I think one could look at, in whichever position you take on it, it's worthwhile because first, this is a position of a government agency that's influential and it is understudied within the literature. And second, if it's wrong, it's worth pointing out. But you can also ask the practical question. Institutions are not just doing that. Institutions appear to be taking punitive measures with respect to some sort of hostile environments and not to others. And so if you get only the OCR approach when it comes to anti-Semitism, but the OCR approach when it comes to other forms of discrimination, then you're back in the same conundrum. Overall, I would say the two Davids, and I'm pleased to see we now have two Davids in the room. The two Davids are asking the right question, and I hope that they are able to resolve it in a way that does not require us to make compromises in either direction. Finally, I would say, in considering the distinctive aspects of how the Jewish community responds to this, one thing that you might keep in mind if you are actually focused on Jewish communal response are questions like, to what extent should or should not the Jewish community be concerned about the social backlash that it has feared from time to time? To what extent should it or should it not ignore stereotypes and defamations of Jews as being overly powerful? Creating no-win situations. If you go into this battle and win, they'll say, well, Jews were too powerful and they used their money and power. If you go into it and you lose, then you've lost in a different way. To the extent the question is, what should the Jewish community do? I think it's worth thinking about the different sorts of consideration. And again, Svankin and Dollinger can be helpful here, that have either motivated some to push for forceful action, or on the other hand, led others to do something different. In general, thank you and bravo.
Thank you, Ken. Turning to Samuel now for his comments.
So it seems to me that there are three sort of dimensions in the paper that could perhaps be disaggregated. And the first is the legal and constitutional question, which I think is primary in much of the paper. And I recuse myself on that. I'm not a lawyer, and I do not presume to dictate. A separate question is the strategic one, which strikes me, as Mr. Marcus describes, as fundamentally an empirical and prudential question. What is most likely to produce the desired outcomes? My instinct, though, is that you're right, David, that demanding equal enforcement of existing DEI policies will short-circuit the system, and will paradoxically end up promoting more liberal policies, and we've seen that with the adoption of some version of institutional neutrality by many institutions. So you refer to the infamous difficulty that the president of Harvard and others had in determining whether they would ban phrases like from the river to the sea. You know, if they had been consistent civil libertarians for the last 20 or 30 years, this would not be such a problem. And they would be, I think, entitled to the position that they took, which is that it depends on context, but generally it should be allowed. Of course, we know that that isn't the case. And although the hearings were embarrassing to them and led several of those presidents to be removed from their jobs, I think the results were helpful. And people will say, of course, that the adoption, again, of some version of institutional neutrality hasn't been for the right reasons, and it's been reluctant. I would say, who cares? I mean, if you're waiting for major social institutions to do things for the right reasons and at the right time, you will be waiting for a while. So my instinct, again, is demand that they enforce every policy that they have consistently and rigorously, and see if they're really willing to do that. And my suspicion is that they will find that so difficult that they would rather modify the policies than meet the demand. But again, that's just an instinct, and there are scholars and practitioners who have a lot more knowledge and experience than I do, who could probably provide more reliable advice. I would focus then on the sort of conceptual dimension, which as a political theorist by training I'm allowed to do. I don't really know anything about the law, I don't really know anything about how to do things in the world, but I know a lot about words and concepts, so I'll talk a lot about words and concepts. And it struck me that in the paper, which I understand is only a draft, that there is some slippage and even conflation of three concepts that overlap but seem to me distinct, and those are academic freedom, free speech, and free expression. And needless to say, again, they do overlap in many of these situations, but I don't think they require precisely the same response. So how to disaggregate them? Academic freedom, I think, is properly understood as the freedom of individual members of the faculty to engage in scholarship and teaching, subject to professional judgment. It doesn't mean they can just do whatever they want. Anyone who has taught a university class knows this. You can't just teach whatever you want. You have to file a syllabus. It's subject to certain kinds of review. But there is a presumption that the individual teacher and scholar will be able to determine the content and direction of their work. And I think that is generally a good thing, and we should be very reluctant to interfere with that. But that's also quite limited. It has to do with the classroom and scholarly publications. Free speech is a broader category. First, in to whom it applies, not only individual faculty members, but students, institutional units, organizations, and so on. But also in what it covers. It's not limited to its contribution to the academic enterprise. And you present yourselves in the paper as defenders of free speech, and I am too in this broader sense, but it's worth remembering just how broad a privilege this is in academic settings. I mean, there's no other institution where people think that they are entitled to say pretty much whatever they want to whomever they want, unless it veers into threats, harassment, defamation, or other criminal activity. Now, the fact that this is an unusually broad privilege doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it. But we should think hard about why we have it. And to me, the most plausible argument in favor of broad protections of free speech on campus is not really one of principle so much as one of prudence. And the prudential consideration is that if you try to imagine any institution, any regime of enforcement that would be better than just letting people mostly say the kind of thing that they want to say, the result is almost always worse. I mean, it's hard to imagine how this would fail to be arbitrary and intrusive and constraining in all sorts of ways that we don't want. So there, I think, again, the justification and the dimensions are different to academic freedom and could be separated somewhat in the paper. Then finally, there's free expression. Which in the draft is used almost synonymously with free speech, and I would be cautious there. I'm skeptical of the category of free expression, at least in a university context. So the thing about free speech, and I'll apologize for being pedantic, but I'm not really apologizing, is that there's a built-in reference to language. Free speech is about saying something verbally or in writing, and that's important both because it's a particular form of expression and it invites a particular kind of response. Part of the justification for free speech, especially in academic settings, is that you can answer. You can ask questions, you can raise an objection, and it creates a special kind of conversation which is oriented toward greater understanding. Free expression, I don't think does that, or only questionably does that. And part of the problem is the word expression, which again, I'll apologize for being pedantic, but I'm not sorry, is inherently one way. Free expression is not about a conversation. It's not about asking and answering or exchanging reasons. It is about bringing out what is within me. And that can be the beginning of a conversation, but it is not per se part of a conversation. And that makes it, to me, more suspect than free speech in the linguistic sense. Also, free expression, and this gets into the issue of conduct, is not limited to speech. It includes actions, or it uses speech as a kind of action. And here's a practical example that illustrates the difference. I think saying from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, or something like that, in a course on nationalism or Middle East history is not the same as passing out a leaflet that says that on the quad, or whatever, and even that is not the same as shouting it through a bullhorn or constructing a human chain or something of that kind. That veers into non-linguistic conduct that does not invite response or conversation, and I do not think contributes to the ultimate purpose of a university, which is the pursuit of knowledge, or at least of some kind of understanding. So I emphasize this because in the paper you point out that a lot of this debate really is about conduct, and that's not a hard case, or these aren't hard cases for free speech advocates. But I would go a little bit beyond that and say that there are kinds of ostensible speech that really are conduct, like shouting through a bullhorn, that do not serve a purpose, a conversational purpose, and do not promote inquiry. And there, maybe I would be less tolerant than you would be. I do think universities are and should remain places for confronting and analyzing and assessing ideas, including provocative ideas and ones that I consider wrong. I don't think they are appropriately settings for social movement tactics. And again, some of those tactics are pure conduct in a way that is not problematic. But I think chanting, drumming, the use of amplification, all of these things really belong to a different category to pure free speech, and again, could be usefully disaggregated.
All right, thank you very much, Samuel. So before we turn to your questions, so get them ready. I have a couple of questions for the panel. Take this back up to the 30,000 foot level a little bit. So one argument I've heard is that when it comes to thinking about the dilemma between free speech protections and civil rights protections, that there really isn't a dilemma because free speech protections are constitutional, civil rights protections are statutory, and therefore the constitutional protections are the more foundational protections, and we do our analysis through that lens. And I'm interested in the reaction that all of you have to that. I've heard that in the context of other civil rights movements. What do you all think about that argument?
Well, so the book that you mentioned that I wrote over 20 years ago now, You Can't Say That, that's a very big theme of the book, and I got pushback when I'd speak to students who would say, oh, but the First Amendment conflicts with the 14th Amendment. And I said, no, it doesn't. No state shall deny equal protection of the law. It doesn't say anything about requiring people not to speak. As long as everyone could speak, everyone has equal protection. But I think we have to remember two things about campus. Well, I mean, I think something like 80% of colleges and universities are public, and therefore bound by the First Amendment. 20% are not, and the ones that are not include a lot of the more elite and influential universities, which also happen to be the ones, a lot of the private liberal arts colleges where the biggest controversies occur. So they often have in their faculty or student handbooks some sort of guarantee of academic freedom and freedom of speech and so forth, but they're not bound by the First Amendment, and they can, absent some future executive order or congressional legislation, or in California there's a law requiring that students get First Amendment protections on college campuses, public and private. Absent something like that, universities are in fact free to balance speech and civil rights concerns or discrimination concerns as they see fit. But what they're not free to do is whichever rule they adopt, to apply it unevenly to different students. There have been dozens of Title VI complaints filed against universities for discrimination against Jewish students, but unfortunately those are not generally public unless someone puts it out there when they file it. But there have been about a dozen or so lawsuits filed against universities for Title VI violations for Jewish students, and those are publicly available and they're on the internet if you want to read them. And personally, as someone who's interested in these areas and who is concerned with not penalizing students for free speech, and for that matter not encouraging universities to punish their students for their speech, the most persuasive complaints the aspects of complaints I've found are not ones that say, oh, these students were saying this or that, or being mean and so forth, even if you could argue that put together these create a hostile environment, but the ones where the complaints go into great detail about how Jewish students were treated unevenly regardless of what you think of the rules. So it becomes not really a matter of what should the speech rules be, but whatever speech rules you have to apply them evenly in two ways. First, you have to just apply the rules evenly, but also you have to have the same sort of bureaucratic response. I think it was the NYU complaint I was reading where students would go and say, hey, students were threatening me, students were harassing me, students were saying these things that could amount to a hostile environment, and they'd meet with people in the student life office or the dean's office, and they would say, oh yes, we're going to get on that right away, we're going to investigate, and then nothing would happen. Repeatedly, nothing would happen. They'd promise very specific things and nothing would happen. They'd agree that yes, that violates our rules, but they still wouldn't do anything. Now, NYU's gotten a lot better since they settled the lawsuit and I think paid some damages. But that sort of thing where we don't have to look at the content of the speech, we just have to say you are basically ignoring the complaints of Jewish students, which in some cases you agree are legitimately valid complaints under your own school rules, and then you don't do anything. And thus we don't have to get to the point of, well, are they right that this violates the rules, or what should the rules be? It's okay, you've acknowledged that the rules are being violated, and you would never, and we could also come up with examples as in the complaints where the university acted very expeditiously when other students were complaining about violations of rules, or where students were not masking during COVID or otherwise. But when these rules are violated and people are blocking entrances and all that, nothing happens. That I think becomes an easy case.
All right, thank you.
Let me just say in different words that it's complicated. So first, an initial sort of prefatory observation is that to the extent that courts have been looking at some of these cases so far, the main issue they've looked at is not a First Amendment issue, but rather whether the standard of deliberate indifference is met. And that's partly because, for all the talk of speech, these incidents that are being litigated tend to involve very serious conduct as well. Second, in some of these cases, we are talking about equal protection clause issues as well as free exercise clause issues. So there certainly are constitutional claims on the civil rights side, and there may be on the speech side as well. David is right, is that it's different with private institutions, and different kinds of issues might arise. Free speech protections are given to private institutions in California by statute. There are potential arguments that free speech obligations have been voluntarily assumed by private institutions in ways that are contractually enforceable. Depending on the specifics of the case, you might have constitutional provision against constitutional provision, you might have contract against statute, or you might have simply a matter of interpreting statutory provisions.
Yes, much more complicated than the false alternative. Yes.
So once again, I'm not a lawyer. So you asked for 30,000 feet. I'll give you 30,000 feet. And that's to say that for me, the question in evaluating these claims is always to what extent they contribute to the goals of a university. There's no way to assess the status of different activities within an academic community without thinking about what an academic community is for. And I think the most plausible answer is that it is for the methodical or disciplinary pursuit of knowledge or understanding through teaching and scholarship. So in every case, the first thing I ask is, does it promote that? Is it contrary to that, or is it about something else entirely? And I think that in general, the kinds of claims that we call civil rights claims tend to be about something else entirely. They have a therapeutic justification, they have an economic justification, they have a political justification, but they don't have an academic justification. And free speech, I think, at least properly understood, does serve an academic purpose. The rest of these restrictions, and I think this is evident if you look at their historical origins, are just not about that. And in that case, I would say they may have their place in other institutions and other areas of public life, but they are not primary considerations in a university.
Okay. So one other question, this ties to a general trend that all of us probably see and experience every day of oversimplifying all issues into left and versus right, and having this dichotomy between the two perspectives. At one point, free speech was associated as something that the left advocated for. Today, it seems it's more associated with something that the right advocates for. Civil rights, something that the left advocated for. Now I'm not sure. So when we think about the free speech protections and those arguments and the people who are in favor, because there is a debate within the community, is it the case that people who tend to be more to the right are the ones who are raising free speech arguments, and the ones who are more to the left are arguing civil rights protections? Or is this not the case?
Well, I think that there's a mixed bag there. It tends to be the groups that are in the minority that tend to be more in favor of free speech, because they're the ones who are most likely to be censored and suppressed. So it's not surprising that with universities today being overwhelmingly left-leaning, that it's people on the right who are more interested in freedom of speech. There might have been a time, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, where most universities were Christian sponsored and conservative, and it was sort of the radical atheists and people who were in favor of birth control and that sort of thing, who were early ACLU people who were arguing for academic freedom and a broader sense of things. But I do want to say that there are plenty of people on the left who are in favor of free speech, even some people on the radical left. But I think and if you left it up to faculties, and this may be changing over time, but even today, if you left it up to faculties, you'd have a fairly, if not quite a consensus, a fairly strong majority in favor of strong protections for free speech on campus and against, disruptive actions and threats and so forth, and it would be more or less what we'd like. And there's two problems here. One problem is that the traditional sort of civil libertarian left has really not stood up to the more radical people on campus who don't believe, as Sam was suggesting, that the purpose of the university is the pursuit of knowledge and so forth, but believe explicitly that it has an ideological purpose, or it should be taken over and used for ideological purposes. I was just looking at someone's bio on X when I saw that they said something I thought was remarkably stupid. I won't say who it was, and I saw the first thing they said in their bio is, I'm an activist and a scholar. Well, if you're an activist, go work for an activist group. That's not your job as a professor. And I'd be embarrassed. I would think, well, who is going to hire me? This was someone without tenure, but he was not abashed in announcing that even though I'm untenured, my first thing I think of myself as is an activist. Well, that's not, to me, the purpose of a university. But in any event, so there's one problem, is that there are more people like that, and the traditional civil libertarian left has not stood up to them like they should. But the maybe bigger problem is that the university bureaucracies are, partly populated because of civil rights legislation, but partly because of internal bureaucratic imperatives, don't believe in freedom of speech at all. They all this therapeutic stuff and all the other things are what they believe the university is about and what they're hired to do. And what I always say is, even universities like Chicago and Yale that officially are committed to institutional neutrality and are very strong officially on academic freedom, the problem is, if you have some sort of civil rights or potential civil rights complaint, there's an entire bureaucracy dedicated to helping you, to promoting it, to calling in the professor and saying, well, I've been asked to meet with the DEI office, I've declined to do so over a tweet of mine, right? But there's a whole bureaucracy. But now I want to say, well, this DEI bureaucracy, they're interfering with my freedom of speech. George Mason has a very strong freedom of speech policy. Who do I go to? We don't have a free speech bureaucracy to counter it. So there's a complete disconnect between the academic side of the university, where I think free speech is still valued, and the bureaucratic side, where it's not valued at all.
So without wanting to make a sweeping assertion about people's politics, I do have a story that might illustrate the point that I think you were asking about. We had a client not that long ago who was involved in a situation where anti-Israel protesters were trying to push him out of student government after he had communicated. Normally I would say expressed, but no, I'm reluctant. So I'll just say he had communicated views that were sympathetic to Israel, which he felt very strongly were not just his political positions, but they were a part of his identity as a Jew. So he was, in his mind, communicating the Zionist aspect of his identity. And we had potential anti-discrimination claims, since he was being treated differently based on his Jewish identity. But he was also being punished based on his expression of views. So we talked to him about this, and he asked us to please not make free speech arguments on his behalf, because in his mind, free speech arguments were associated with the right. He is a liberal. He might be interested in liberal democratic politics, and didn't necessarily want to assert claims that could portray him as being right-wing in a way that might come back to haunt him. So in the minds of at least one student, yes, there is some degree of stigma now on the left associated with this notion of freedom of speech.
Thank you.
I think that in practice, attitudes toward free speech depend almost entirely on whose ox is being gored. I mean, very, very few people have a principled and relatively consistent position. Most people, including quite sophisticated people, lawyers, institutional operators, politicians, respond based on their perception of where their advantage lies. And I think we've seen very rapid shifts in the last year, roughly. So I would say that until October 7th of last year, free speech had become sort of right-coded for reasons that have been described. I have noticed that in the last year, free speech has been rediscovered by the academic left, including by some people whom I'm pretty sure, I'm not going to name them, and I haven't done the Google search, but I'm pretty sure have put free speech, in quotes in the past to signify that this is, as they say, a problematic concept. Why has that happened? It's because they now feel that their freedom is threatened, and they want to claim those protections, and vice versa. To be fair here, I also can think of people on the right who were all in for free speech a couple of years ago, who now issue sort of demands that classes be canceled and signs be banned in ways that they weren't when they thought that their views were at stake. So it would be nice if more people were consistent about this, and I appreciate the effort of the paper in working toward a consistent position, but the politics are heavily contingent and really quite predictable once you see who is in the majority or who has the power in a particular situation and who doesn't.
Thank you. All right, we have time for questions. Please wait until the mic comes to you, and we'll start at the back, please, and work our way forward.
Thank you so much for a great paper, great panel. I'm on the mailing lists of David E.'s organization and Ken's organization. I want to thank you for the great work that your groups are doing and the great information you put out. I have one observation, and my name is Nadine Strassen, by the way. I have one observation and one question. The observation is really related to the overall mission of Voices for Liberty, which is to show the interrelationship between freedom of speech or other liberty values and equality values and human rights values. And this is so striking in all of your remarks. I think what triggered my reaction was Samuel's use of the metaphor of short-circuiting by asking Jewish students and Jewish expression to be, and hostile expression against Jews to be treated the same way as other similar expression but aimed at different people. That reminded me of an old, very important opinion by Felix Frankfurter in a 1940s case in which he explained that the whole purpose of the Equal Protection Clause was a way to propel protection of substantive rights, that by forcing government to choose between leveling up or leveling down, there would be so many pressures to level up the protection of individual liberties. So I think this is a nice way of illustrating the overall theme of this important organization. Now, my question is, especially for those of you who have been in the trenches, what are some positive examples of campuses that have done this well, that have promoted DEI in the fullest sense, right? Equally respecting and including all individuals, regardless of race, religion, national origin, regardless of their view on these issues, and also protecting free speech. And in particular, can you give us examples of campuses, or if not specific examples, what you would propose for campuses to counter hostile environment, harassment, without in any way suppressing offensive speech that some people view as hate speech.
Let me start with Ken on this question because I'm sure you're aware of specific examples on campus where this has gone, positive things have occurred.
So Debbie, I'm aware of positive things that have happened on campuses, but I'm not sure that I'm aware of any that have met the standards that Professor Strawson has described, and it's an honor to be with Professor Strawson. I don't want to dwell, but when Professor Strawson describes DEI in its fullest sense, she might be describing something that's inconsistent with what I understand DEI to be in its actual manifestations today. And in fact, DEI as it exists today has been, for the students we work with, more a part of the problem than of the solution, which is to say it is almost best case scenario for the DE office to be useless on these issues. The worst case, of course, is for them to propagandize an ideology of oppressors and oppressed in which Jewish students are then stereotyped as being privileged and powerful and so on and so forth. There are universities that we don't hear from, that is to say, where students don't call us on the phone complaining. But as for universities that are doing the right thing, I could say that there are universities have done a few things that I think are positive steps, sometimes in response to legal complaints. So for example, I think that this university has recently taken a number of steps that are helpful, ranging from policies limiting masking, or at least requiring people in masks to identify themselves on being asked, relating to limitations across the board on encampments. Also, I would argue that their policy on the use of the hour working definition with respect to identifying the intent by which discriminatory actions have taken place. NYU recently has indicated that the term Zionism should in some cases be understood to be a code word for Jew. And just because the word Zionist is used rather than Jew, that doesn't mean it's not discriminatory. The University of Illinois, in response to our complaints, has now changed its policies. All of these are for the good. Fundamentally, though, to me, the real issue isn't just how does a university respond to a particular incident, as if the university had nothing to do with the circumstances or conditions under which the incident developed. To really tackle the issue, the university should be asking, are we part of the problem even before the incident? Have we been encouraging this sort of incident either through misuse of a DEI program, through curricula that is one-sidedly anti-Zionist, through admissions policies where students say, why was I punished for this sort of activity when I think I was admitted based on my essay when I said that I was doing this sort of thing? Based on there is a whole cluster of ways in which the university is itself, I would argue, complicit in the actions that take place, and then they act as if we can't do anything because it's just speech, when the university created the conditions of the speech. Mm-hmm. Are there any universities that are actually asking those questions? I don't think there are, but they should be.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Ellen Du Bois from UCLA, and I'm a historian, which, by the way, is where Mark Dollinger came from and did his work. So I wanted to put a historical perspective on this here in two or maybe three ways. Two ways about the Jewish problem and one about the larger problem of universities. First of all, having been a student in universities many decades ago and teaching in them now, I would point out that the Jewish presence on campus, its intellectual, I don't know what right word to use, its impact has been very different. That 50 years ago, the Jewish presence on campus was a force in favor of civil rights. And now the Jewish presence, by which I mean people who are manifestly or identified as Jewish, is about Zionism. So that non-Zionist Jews, one could barely identify them as Jews in a context. They don't identify themselves. They're not part of Hillel ever. So I'm not saying this in terms of discrimination.
Because of the time,
All right, I'm
actually
sorry.
hear the whole. I would love to hear the whole thing, but because of the time, could we distill it down to?
Oh,
the
I'm
question?
sorry.
That's
I'm
all right.
very
I'm looking
sorry.
at the time, and the other David Bernstein has arrived, so I at least want to introduce.
All right,
him.
I just want to say the other thing, which is, I think one of the deeper problems is that students don't learn about anti-Semitism. They have no idea that it's a kind of racism. And if there was more instruction about the long history of anti-Semitism, the problem would look different. Thank you.
Thank you. No, please. Any reactions?
I would just agree with that. I won't, the first point, we could have a very long discussion, so I won't address that. But the second point, I agree that there's ignorance of anti-Semitism. I think it's related to a broader phenomenon, which is that everyone wants to shoehorn every ethnic, racial, and religious conflict in the entire world into an American paradigm, so that people, you see people saying ridiculous things one way or the other. Oh, Jews were oppressed in Nazi Germany because they weren't white, which was not what the Nazis had their own weird racial ideology. Or they'll say the opposite, that it's just white on white violence, so we shouldn't be concerned about it because it didn't involve it just involved two oppressor groups, so who cares? Both of these are ridiculously reductionist views that completely ignore the unique Jewish experience of oppression, which is not the same as the black experience in the United States and needs to be studied on its own. And I would just say we're doing something very wrong, that we have all these Holocaust education programs that are very well funded, and yet students come out of them not knowing anything about anti-Semitism nevertheless.
As quickly as I can, yes, universities should be teaching about anti-Semitism to the same extent that they're teaching about other forms of bias, but that's not enough. If you simply take the current structures as they are and insert anti-Semitism, you'll still have a problem, because what you have is 3 levels of challenge. On the one hand is the absence of treating anti-Semitism similarly with other forms of bias. Below that, though, you have the structure that I described earlier, where bias is understood in terms of oppressor-oppressed and other related ideologies, critical race theory and the like. So simply adding anti-Semitism won't address that. And below that, fundamentally, you have an absence of commitment to particular values, Western values, tolerance, equality, so on and so forth, which I think that we've departed from too much. So to me, yes, we should be teaching about anti-Semitism, but it has to be in a much broader context for it to be helpful.
So maybe this is an area of disagreement, but I would say universities should do more teaching about anti-Semitism, only, again, to return to my metaphor, to short-circuit the whole enterprise. When students arrive on campus, the first thing they encounter is not academic instruction or courses or preparation for learning. It's these seminars about bias and discrimination, and adding anti-Semitism to that does not get at the fundamental problem. So yes, let's do it. And the thing will become unmanageable because they keep adding, new categories and new topics, and you can't do that. There has to be a limit. But this is where, again, I would ask what the purpose of this enterprise is, and I'm not sure that instructing students in the grievance histories of the world is a necessary part of a college education, and certainly I question whether it should be the first message that they get when they set foot on campus.
All right, thank you very much. And there really are 2 David Bernsteins. David L. Bernstein is here, and we are at the end of our time, but David, in 10, 15 seconds, what impact do you hope this paper will have when finished?
Well, can I take a few more than 10 or 15 seconds?
Not too many more, but please go.
Okay, all right. First of all, I appreciated Nadine Strawson's question about DEI. I just wanted to say that Danielle Allen, who's an African-American political philosopher at Harvard, was part of a presidential task force on DEI that tried to actually incorporate viewpoint diversity in the DEI structure of Harvard, and it passed, but then was fundamentally ignored by the university. And I think that's the problem. These bureaucracies simply don't want to do it. And we have to sort of understand that reality. Maybe it'll change at some point, but I don't hold out a lot of hope. I was sitting with a University of Pennsylvania student on the train this morning who's Jewish, and I told him about this FIRE survey that's held University of Pennsylvania to really be on the bottom of a free speech campus. They do this survey every year, and Penn and Harvard were among and Columbia, I think, were at the bottom of the list. And he said, that's not really fair. And I said, why? He says, well, we have all these restrictive policies, but no one pays attention to them, and you can really say whatever you want on campus. And I said, well, can you say that you're a Zionist in your political science class? He goes, no, not really. And I said, why? Well, I'll get penalized, and people get, and in his view, free speech was this sort of legal or formalistic right, but he didn't see it as a cultural reality. And for me, that second category, free speech as a culture, even if we choose to call it something different, is actually the more important reality that we have to work toward. That's where, and maybe this is where I'm answering your question, because ultimately we want campuses where students can talk, where professors can talk, and those are campuses that are going to be less hostile to the Jewish community. They're going to be more open. They're going to be better places to be students, and they're going to be better learning environments. And this is where I go to maybe the disagreement that I have with my namesake, David E. here, which is that, and I don't want to overplay it because I think we agree on nearly everything, but I don't want to ultimately side with equal protection because the bigger battle is to create a free speech environment. In my experience with DEI structures, and you don't even have to call it DEI, it might be called something else, is that ultimately, when they add anti-Semitism, they don't do away with the DEI structure. Okay, one thing. They don't do away with the DEI structure.
Yeah.
What they do is they just give it its 15 minutes, like maybe 15 seconds, like I'm going to. They leave the DEI in place, and they do everything they were going to do anyway. And that's how we'll be treated if we emphasize equal protection. That's why I think ultimately the long game is for free speech and creating free speech cultures that support everybody.
So there really is a debate between the two Davids and a real range of views on this topic. And so it's just interesting to know about a dilemma within one type of movement. So that's the end of our panel. We have a 10-minute break, so if everyone could be back here at 10:15. There are refreshments out in the hallway. You can find the restrooms out here. For our virtual audience, please come back at 10:15. And thank you to our paper authors and our panelists.